All right. Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We're continuing to read High Risers by Ben Austin, and we are on page 137. Let's see. Okay. As the black population of the near north side dwindled, those remaining were also in the process of being reconceptualized. Welfare families, single mothers, the perennially unemployed, the social programs of the Great Society have failed to lift them out of the depths of generational poverty. William Julius Wilson, then a sociologist at the University of Chicago, explained that larger structural transformations had robbed black neighborhoods in Chicago of much of their remaining wealth and stability. From 1967 to 1987, amid the shift from an industrial to a service economy, the city lost some 325,000 manufacturing jobs. Two-thirds of the jobs growth in the Chicago area occurred outside the city. Middle-class and working-class African Americans moved from their longtime neighborhoods, following jobs and better housing opportunities elsewhere, leaving behind a concentration of poor families. During the 1970s, the percentage of families living well below the poverty line increased in 25 of Chicago's predominantly black communities. The number of black communities with unemployment rates above 15% jumped from 1 to 15. In his book, The Truly Disadvantaged, Wilson argued that those who were financially better off had acted as role models for the poor, buffers against both economic and personal collapse. Their departure, he asserted, compounded the impact of joblessness, resulting in, quote, concentration effects, end quote, the, quote, social pathologies, end quote, and, quote, ghetto-specific culture and behavior, end quote, that came to dominate. By 1983, 3/4 of the black children born in Chicago were to unmarried mothers. Graduation rates at public high schools in black and Latino neighborhoods fell below 40%. The average age at which African Americans were arrested for violent crimes fell lower and lower. Quote, welfare and the underground economy are not only increasingly relied upon, end quote, Wilson wrote, quote, they come to be seen as a way of life, end quote. Wilson was building on the controversial Moynihan Report of 1965. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then the Assistant Secretary of Labor under President Johnson, wrote of the, quote, tangle of pathology, end quote, afflicting families in black ghettos. His language of disease distracted from his warnings about the increasing breakdown of social structures in impoverished black neighborhoods. Wilson, an African-American scholar, was stressing that the problems of out-of-wedlock births, single-mother families, lack of formal education, and criminality had only worsened in the ensuing 2 decades. People in these high-poverty areas have fallen further outside the occupational and behavioral mainstream, and more than ever, he insisted, these issues needed to be addressed candidly. During the Reagan years, Wilson was sometimes mistaken for a conservative, since his rejection of liberal orthodoxies intersected with the view of inner-city ghettos fostered by scholars on the right. Charles Murray, among others, denounced welfare programs as the actual cause of the black family's dissolution, contending that poor people made the rational market decision to forego low-wage work for government handouts, and that parents even calculated to have more children out of wedlock for the bump in benefits another dependent provided. By this reasoning, it was more charitable to do away with all social welfare. But Wilson debunked these fallacies. The Earned Income Tax Credit, for instance, was established in the 1970s, and by conservatives' logic, the expanded benefits for those who worked should have driven down the welfare rolls. Like Moynihan, he proposed not that government assistance be slashed, but rather doled out more generously and strategically. Still, the popularizing of the notion that neighborhoods of concentrated poverty were destroying their inhabitants' lives and creating a permanent, quote, ghetto underclass, end quote, had a similar effect on many moderates and liberals at the end of the century as it had on the CHA do-gooders in 1950 who set out to raise the Little Hell slum that were emboldened to rethink the government's role in these communities, which now meant talking openly about retrenching the welfare state. Nowhere in Chicago were the concentration effects that Wilson lamented more pronounced than in the forced isolation and density of high-rise public housing. By the 80s, Chicago was home not only to 3 of the country's 12 richest communities, but also, amazingly, to 10 of the country's 16 poorest census tracts, all of them containing large public housing complexes. Wilson pointed out that 83% of those living at Cabrini Green in the early 80s were on welfare, And of the families with children, 90% of them, at least officially, had only a mother at home. Quote, "The project simply magnified these problems," end quote, Wilson wrote. The Chicago Urban League issued a report calling for an end to the tyranny of the high-rises. Editorial boards announced that Chicago was ready to rid its landscape of these civic disgraces. For residents of Cabrini Green, the public discourse about their fate was more evidence that the mass evictions they'd always feared were finally upon them. Yes, they lived in what was now being recognized as concentrated poverty, but by necessity, they'd also made it their home. Families grew up next to one another, generations of them. They watched one another's children, shopped together, shared food, stepped up when a family lost a loved one or was in need. Many relied on an off-the-books economy of hairdressers, handymen, makeup artists, babysitters, auto mechanics, manicurists, shoe shiners, tailors, cooks, carpenters, and candy sellers. People bartered services and passed along news of job openings. Theories about concentrated poverty often ignored all that. Cabrini residents didn't know how they'd manage elsewhere without the support of these longtime networks. They'd worried that crime and poverty would exist wherever they were sent, and it seemed doubtful that tearing down the most visible incarnation of these concentration effects would do away with the discrimination, government inefficiency, and fear that went into making the Cabrini Greens of the city and the country in the first place. A group calling itself the Concerned Tenants of Cabrini Green Homes announced a community-wide meeting to warn of the power brokers who were then plotting against them. The flyers that were taped to lampposts and the walls of high-rise lobbies asked, quote, "Are we next? Where will we go?" End quote. In the handbills line drawings, men in suits identified as, quote, investors, quote, developers, and land grabbers, end quote, stand to one side, laughing. A man labeled, quote, tenant, end quote, cowers, while an extended leg with, quote, CHA, end quote, written along it delivers the banishing kick. That brings us to a changing of the theme in this chapter. And some of the first parts of, these passages we read reminds me of some of the things that we read in Cornel West's book Race Matters, where he grappled with the black conservatism and black liberalism and the pros and cons of both and the shortcomings that both of them have. And I think that one of the things that's important when speaking about conditions that black people live in, conditions that brown people live in, conditions that poor people and working class people live in, is that there is no one train of thought that is correct about fixing some of these things. I think the thing that stands out the most is they talked about how it would take a strategic effort to deal with these things. And yes, it is true that it is, just like in any walk of life, there are people who try to find ways, who try to survive by, I don't want to say manipulating, because that has like a negative connotation, but by playing the game that exists. There are rich people who do things who to specifically try to preserve the money that they have. Specifically people talk about, things that rich people do to not pay taxes. People who are slumlords and own property do things to cut corners, as we've read here, to try to save money or make more money on their property. So it's not exclusively poor or exclusively ghetto or exclusively black or exclusively brown thing to try to find ways to preserve more money or to make more money or to survive. So, of course, there were families who are women who probably did have more children so they could get more money on welfare, or that they could get more money for the dependents. But that's not a wholesale thing. And also that goes to, in my opinion, that goes to show the fact that these people are desperate. These people feel like they have no other way to help the situation that they are in, except to try to manipulate some of the things that have been set out for them. The same thing when you speak about welfare. It isn't out of the realm of imagination or the realm of thinking that somebody would look and say, working a job, and we read about this in here already a few different times, working a job They're going to lose all the benefits that come with the welfare program, but then they're going to also work a job where they're not making as much money as they were getting from these welfare programs. That's not a fallacy for the individual who is forced to make that decision. That's a fallacy for the capitalistic society that we live in, where people aren't being given livable wages. And too often people take the short-hanging fruit of condemning people who are poor for being poor, condemning people who are in ghettos for being in ghettos, instead of understanding that we live in a society that is full of wealth. We live in this society that is full of wealth and full of money. And if the only reason that people go without is because there are other people who have more than they need, who have an overabundance, and who are exploiting these people who are going without. And I just think that the same thing goes for the mentality. They spoke about the mentality that was existing in these neighborhoods that changed over the last 20 years, or that got worse over the 20 years from the 60s to the 80s. And it's important to point out that within those 20 years, there were profits cut from welfare programs, from food programs. We read in here how they cut programs within education. And all of those things are part of the cycle that leads to people making some of the decisions that they are condemned for when they are in poverty and when they are stuck, isolated in ghettos. All right, Kelvin Cannon. On June 7th, 1984, Robert Cannon drove to Stateville to fetch his son. Kelvin had been barely 18 when he was sent away. Now he was 21, with a body reshaped by weightlifting and starchy prison food. His waist size had stretched from a 28 to a 36, his neck thickened, and his chest now rolled with heavy muscles. He didn't own a single item of clothing that fit. Cannon had earned $800 working in Statesville's kitchen, and his father took him straight to Maxwell Street, the freewheeling outdoor market, where Cannon bought everything from pants and shirts to socks and underwear. His next stop was Cabrini Green. In the months before his release, Cannon needed to find a place where he could live. When he left for prison, his son was 3 months old. The boy was now 4.5, but his mother had married and had additional children. He obviously wasn't going to stay with her. Cannon's mother lost the apartment in 714 West Division because of his conviction, and his father didn't invite him to join his new family on the South Side. Cannon reached out to William Blackman, his best friend growing up. William was home after a stint in jail, and he told Cannon how good it felt to be back on the street. Cannon said he'd soon join him. Quote, "Just lay low until I get out there," end quote, Cannon said. But then word reached him in Stateville that his friend was killed while trying to break into a Cabrini apartment. Another childhood friend now lived in 1230 North Burling, the same building in which Cannon committed the robbery that got him locked up. And the friend said Cannon could stay with him. So that's where he went. Another former inmate paroled to Cabrini Green. Cannon had heard countless times that prison either makes you or breaks you. It definitely didn't break him. He'd served time with the leaders of the disciples and won their trust, proving himself over the years. He'd gone in strong and come out stronger. Now, back home, people looked up to him for the time he'd served. He was a role model. The gangster disciples were organized with regents, assistant coordinators, governors, and a system for levying taxes. Cannon was named the Disciples' Don at Cabrini Green, and a year later, at 22, was appointed governor of all Cabrini Green. Quote, "Cannon would be a success no matter what he did," end quote, a police officer who worked the Cabrini beat said. Quote, "If he grew up in suburban Glencoe, he'd be a doctor with the prettiest wife and the biggest house. At Cabrini Green, he aspired to be like the most successful people in his community. He hit it out of the park. He became that guy." Sorry about that little mic feedback. I think one of the things I want to point out from that is that is true for a lot of these individuals in these situations, is that the circumstances that you are born into, the circumstances that you grow up in, dictate the kind of life that you will have. And a lot of times people don't want to admit to that because it means that some of the successes that they had were not in their hands, or that not in their hands, but that it's not simply them individually that made sure that they had that success. And it's a lot easier sometimes when you're dealing with failures to be able to identify how the circumstances and situations that you were in led to those failures. It's a harder pill to swallow when you have successes sometimes, to admit that those successes were done through the privileges of your circumstances or your situations. A lot of people who are born in poverty and in ghettos and in lower class communities and in impoverished communities, if they were born in high class communities or middle class communities or in rich communities, would have had a totally different set of circumstances that they lived in, or that would have grow up to be totally different people. And the same thing is true for people who grow up in rich neighborhoods and in upper middle class neighborhoods. If they grew up in poor neighborhoods and working class neighborhoods, the life that they ended up having would be vastly different. Cannon didn't have to recruit, since most of the boys wanted to be gangster disciples. It looked like fun to the young guys, and it paid for diapers and dinners, sneakers and jackets. Cannon told the ones who were 13 or 14, the same age he'd been when Bo John recruited him, that they needed to spend more time in school before they could choose to be a GD. They had to have some education first. He liked to think of himself as a peacetime leader, not a war one. He'd practice drawing his gun in his bathroom mirror, working on his speed like in the Westerns. One time he accidentally shot a hole in the medicine cabinet. But he wasn't into battling with the other organizations. He'd get up in the mornings, walk the land, see what was going on, and learn what had happened the day before. Sometimes he had to have friends violated, physically punished, when they snatched a purse or robbed another member's house or raped. There was a code, and it had to be enforced. A guy might get GD glasses, punched in the face so many times his eyes swelled up into puffy rows. Or they could get worse. Cannon's goal was to smooth out problems before they reached to that point. He thought some of the unity he seen in prison could be used back home. Guys at Cabrini had gone to school together, slept in the same apartments, eating at the same tables. And now that they were older and part of different organizations, he didn't see why they couldn't still coexist. He threw back-to-school picnics and organized sports leagues. The smoother he could make each day, the less chaos there was, the better he felt he was doing his job. As governor, Cannon never got rich. This wasn't Scarface or Miami Vice, no boats or sports cars or penthouse apartments along the Chicago River. He even held down legit jobs at the same time, driving out to the suburbs to work as a forklift operator at a plant that mass-produced prepared foods. Just as William Julius Wilson had documented, most of the low-skilled jobs had moved out to the suburbs, if not out of Chicago and the country altogether. You couldn't walk or take a bus to a suburban office park or manufacturing plant. You needed a car, and one that didn't break down in winter, which is what happened to Cannon. His car stopped working, and he lost a factory job. Cannon did get his own apartment in 1230 North Burling, and he managed to fix it up. Outside, the hallways were scribbled with tags. Inside, his 13th floor apartment, everything was bright rugs and blinds and plush furniture. He topped glass tables with framed photographs and hung 2 large paintings of Black Panthers. It was a 3-bedroom, and he moved his mother in with him, since he was the reason she had been forced out in the first place. Police raided the apartment every other month or so. From the lobby or the upper floors, you could see them coming, and word would reach Cannon that the officers were on their way upstairs. He'd open his door and lie on the carpeted floor before they got there. No need to wreck anything or throw him to the ground. The cops might kick him in the side for being a smartass, but they knew they weren't going to find anything. And while he was arrested many times for possession of drugs, intimidation, disorderly conduct, he managed to avoid another conviction. After the police raids, when Cannon was alone again in his apartment, he stared out the window, past the surrounding high-rises to the corridors along Lakeshore Drive. To the condos along Lakeshore Drive. Quote, "It looked like I was up there by the Gold Coast area," end quote, he'd say. Quote, "If you looked out my window, you swear you weren't in Cabrini. It was luxury," end quote. And that brings us to the end of chapter 7 and to the beginning of chapter 8, which is entitled, "This Is My Life." I think one of the things that stands out to me about that last passage is the acclamation to police terrorism that Kelvin Cannon had dealt with. I think one of the other things that stands out is the hypocrisy of the policies that exist in public housing, where Kelvin's mother was kicked out because he was arrested and convicted, and then when he was released, he had to have somewhere to go to for him to come home, and he ended up being back in Cabrini Green to live with a friend, and then eventually he had his own apartment in Cabrini Green, which he moved his mother into. And so that just goes to show you that the evicting of the mother out of the home because of her son being convicted, it did nothing. It did nothing to deter the situations or the circumstances that Cannon's life was under. And I'm sort of fumbling over my words here. I guess the point that I'm making is that these policies that exist in public housing, they're not deterrents to decisions that are made by individuals that live in public housing, and they're not even consistent with what these people deal with once they're released, because he was fine to move in, go there once he was released. He was fine to get his own apartment there. And so his mother was punished essentially for no reason. And that is something that happened regularly. And I think that those are the type of things that it takes time to have that policy written. It takes time to enforce the policy of the conviction. And it takes manpower for somebody to be in charge of making sure people get evicted. I should have said evicted, not a conviction. Manpower to make sure people get evicted from their homes. And the psychological damage that it does, the damage that it does to families is completely unnecessary. It's completely unwarranted. It makes no sense to make somebody homeless because somebody who lived with them was convicted of a crime. And all it does is just add to the psychological effects or the psychological trauma that these people were living under. And the same thing, one of the things that we read earlier, Cannon talked about how his life was changed, or he changed his life after he went to prison. But it was clear once he got out of prison, even though his mentality might have been different, he was still in the same circumstances. He still was doing some of the same activities, making some of the same decisions. And while he was out, his son grew up, and the woman he had the child with married somebody else. His mother was kicked out the house. His father moved to another house and had a new family and wouldn't let him move in there. And so even though that there may have been benefits that he got from being in prison, they were far outweighed by the negative things that went on in his life while he was in prison. Okay. I'm trying to decide whether we should start on this next chapter. Yeah, let's go ahead and start this next chapter. We'll read a passage through here and then we'll end this episode. Chapter 8. This is my life. J.R. Fleming. Before changing his name in his early 30s to Willie J.R. Fleming, he was Willie McIntosh Jr. People were always shouting. He was William McIntosh Jr. People were always shouting, quote, Junior, 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 end quote. It made him feel small. Growing up, J.R. heard countless stories about his father. Willie McIntosh Sr. had volunteered for Vietnam and later went AWOL. They said he was Chicago's Frank Lucas, linking up with poppy producers in Southeast Asia and shipping the product stateside. He supposedly worked as a CIA operative in Nicaragua, and who knew where else. They said he ran guns into Cabrini Green. His nickname was Sweetness, and J.R. knew his father had to be slick to get his mother, a black-on-black love, stop the violence war protester, to marry him. Quote, let sleeping dogs lie, end quote, Marlene McIntosh would say when J.R. asked specifics about his father. J.R. was one of their 6 children, and when he was born, in 1973, they lived in the Henry Horner Homes. A few years later, they came to Cabrini Green. They lived in the 1150 North Sedgwick building, The Rock, and J.R.'s father would sit out front with his friends, teaching J.R. how to fight, pitting him against other little boys as part of a training regimen, yelling at him to keep his guard up, to jab. Then, just as Jane Byrne was set to move into their high-rise, the McIntoshes left. Willie Sr. went to another of the red high-rises at Cabrini with a girlfriend. Marlene took the children to the south side, first to the Robert Taylor Homes, where J.R. played on the softball team named Tough Enough, and then on to the cylindrical towers of the Hilliard homes. Excuse me. Marlene had a city job in Harold Washington's administration, and she was offered the chance to leave public housing and relocate with the rental voucher to the southern suburb of Dalton, a nearly all-white village about 12 blocks beyond the Chicago city limits. Marlene imagined she could give her children a better life there, and that's how J.R. ended up in a small house in the suburbs. They lived on a tree-lined street of single-family bungalows. Their home had yards in front and back, a basement, an attic, and a porch. The meadows of a large public park began at their corner. Quote, "It was beautiful," end quote, J.R. said. They were one of 3 black families from 142nd Street all the way to 151st, and sometimes while they walked to school, people let their dogs loose to chase them. J.R. was never one to lack for confidence, though. In Dalton, he earned money raking leaves and shoveling snow and delivering newspapers. Determined to prove he was at least as smart as the white kids, he read through the encyclopedia, A to Z, studied almanacs, and challenged his teachers. When the middle school administrator told him he couldn't, quote, court, end quote, white girls, he was undeterred. When someone spray painted, quote, "niggers go back," end quote, on their garage, he told the older boy next door, an acne-scarred white drag racer known as Big John, and they hunted down the perpetrators. Big John brought along a shotgun and blasted out the windows of the other boys' cars. J.R. grew big himself, 6 feet and 200 pounds by the start of high school. He played basketball in the winter and tennis in the spring, but it was football he liked the most. The coach said they didn't do race on their team. They relied on one another, and all that mattered on the squad was kicking the asses of the guys on the other side of the line. It seemed to J.R. that the entire town came out for Friday night games. There were alumni club pancake breakfasts, and Sundays huddled in the dens of his teammates to watch the Bears. His sophomore year, J.R. was the starting running back. They called him Mac Attack, and he strutted around in his Letterman jacket. When he walked home after practice, still wearing his pads, people would call out greetings from passing cars, shouting that their nephews or neighbors' sons were on the team too. The players needed to keep a C average or higher, but J.R. was a member of the Academic Honor Society. He aced the college boards, a 29 on the ACT, thinking he was destined for college ball. And although he gave weed and coke each a try, he believed that he needed to keep his body pure for sports. He'd explode on the heavy metal boys in their Megadeth t-shirts smoking in the school bathroom. Quote, "Don't you know I'm a recovering asthmatic? Do you want me to have a bad game? Are you working for the other team?" End quote. J.R.'s older sisters, Joyce, moved back to Cabrini Green. Their father was still there, along with their mother's sisters and cousins. On weekends, when there were no games and his mother was working, J.R. took the bus and train north to visit. His cousin Greg, known as G-Ball, ran with the Disciples in 1117 North Cleveland, Dolores Wilson's old high-rise, which residents now called the Castle. J.R. would hear from him accounts of Castle crew friends and enemies killed, of being shot at or shooting someone else. Back in Dalton, J.R. would lie awake nights thinking about Joyce, imagining the danger that engulfed her in the projects. But there was a certain kind of aloneness to the suburbs that also filled J.R. with dread. He craved an audience and pressured himself to succeed in part to keep people around him. The better he was at sports, the larger the crowds that wanted to hang out. He learned to tell stories of his exploits, to entertain, megaphoning his words, a whirlwind of pantomimed emotions. In Dalton, neighbors would pull into their driveways after work and close themselves indoors. Adults socialized only now and then outside their fenced-in backyards. When the street baseball or the backyard basketball ended at dusk, the other kids went in for dinner and the block fell silent. For J.R., that wasn't a peaceful quiet. So the summer after his junior year, when he needed to rehab a knee injury, he asked to stay with Joyce at Cabrini Green. He transferred to a high school not far from Dalton. The team played in a higher division with more college scouts watching. The plan was for him to go to a physical therapist near Cabrini and spend a couple of months in the city as he readied himself for fall football. For 17-year-old J.R., living without adult supervision, Cabrini in the summertime no longer looked scary. It looked like paradise. It was 1990, and young people swarmed about, packing the swimming pools and baseball diamonds and basketball courts. Boys rode in front of the buildings on decked out Schwinn's, popping wheelies. Older guys detailed their souped-up cars. There was music, Janet Jackson, Digital Underground, Belle Biv DeVoe's Poison. JR played basketball and softball. And at Cabrini, people didn't go inside at dusk. They partied outside the buildings and not just on the weekend. There were so many girls JR had dated in Dalton, but nothing like this. He'd ask a girl over to Joyce's to order up music videos on the television show The Box. They phoned in their selections, picking rap videos for 99 cents a pop that weren't being shown on MTV or VH1, and chill for the night. When he didn't stay at Joyce's, he slept at an aunt's or a cousin's. Willie Sr. had moved to Alabama by then, but it still felt to JR that everyone there was either family or like family. JR got drunk for the first time. He smoked cigarettes. He got high and stopped going to rehab. One night near the end of August, he was coming back from a party in another high-rise, walking with his cousin, and he fell into the bushes by the basketball courts in Durso Park. Gangster Park, they called it there. He'd been guzzling Old English 800, and he laughed at how drunk he was. When he came 2 hours later, his eyes level with the asphalt, he looked up to see the yellow-red glow of dawn. He realized that he was totally free. Quote, "It's over," end quote. He belonged to no one and to the world. Quote, "This is my life. I'm never going back to the suburbs," end quote. Okay, so we'll end this episode here. And not really much to reflect on in that passage there, except that I think the main thing to point out is that we all become products of our environment in one way or another. So we'll see what the environment has for JR in the coming passages. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to listen to this episode. Please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or to further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And we'll talk tomorrow.